Okay, in the last lecture in this module, we're going to be discussing the process of socialization as it occurs over what we might consider to be a typical life course. And again, we're focusing here on our own society. Clearly, many other types of societies and cultures would have different definitions of this, so we're mainly focusing on modern American society. And you're going to see that there's certainly some changes and cross-cultural comparisons we can make with other societies and cultures, but we're mainly, for the most part, focusing on modern America. So when we talk about the idea of a life course, we're basically talking about the stages that people go through from birth to death. Okay? Now these stages are by no means defined rigidly. We're going to see that they are open to lots of interpretation. And for the most part, these are kind of compiled from examples or theories that have been forwarded by various researchers. But we're just going to kind of present them in an overall kind of way. So clearly when we know, the average human begins life as a child. So from about birth to about 12 years old is when generally we describe ourselves and people in our society as children. Again, we can talk about, when we compare cultures, we can definitely say that definitions of what it means to be a child or the expectations that are put on children are very different from society to society and culture to culture, not only in contemporary times, but we can also take a look at the ways that the definitions of childhood have changed over time. Think about America. What it means to be a child today is much different, perhaps, than what it meant to be a child 200 years ago in colonial America. Okay? I sometimes think about, when you think about colonial America, and if you've, again, hopefully everybody in here obviously has studied American history and know and have a pretty good idea about what colonial America was like. But if you've been to places like here in Pennsylvania, Brandywine or Gettysburg or colonial Williamsburg down in Virginia, or any of those places, you've definitely recognized that the lives of children were much different then. Okay, so, and this goes back to an earlier module we were talking about the agricultural family as an economic unit. Well, clearly, a lot of things that children were asked to do 200 years ago, we would define today in modern society as child labor. Okay, we would not expect children to handle, let's say, large livestock or animals. Again, there are probably people, even in our own society, who were maybe raised on farms and say, well, I was expected to do that. And again, all well and good. As a society as a whole, we typically don't expect the children to do those things. Another probably more on point example, 200 years ago, again, specifically probably in most cases boys, would be handed a gun and told to go hunting and to bring home food to support their family. In today's society, the idea of giving a 10-year-old a gun and sending them to the woods by themselves with the expectation that they had to bring back something, we would regard probably on the verge of abusive. Okay, as certainly at the very least a safety concern. So our concepts of what it is to be a child have changed over time. In general terms, what we can say is the level of dependency in modern children has been broadened. So we generally expect children to kind of be more dependent on adults, specifically adults within their immediate or extended families, for longer periods of time. We certainly, in modern society, require children to participate in education. And we look at this, like I said, this trend toward longer periods of dependency in children. Then we come to the idea of adolescence, which in modern America we generally regard from about 13 years old to about 17, 18 years old. And this idea of adolescence has become so ingrained in our patterns of society, the way we think, we sometimes think about it as what we might consider to be a natural age definition. And I'm going to challenge that. Adolescence is not quote-unquote natural. We tend to think of adolescence, we think of biological changes, which is absolutely true. Notice, of course, about 12 and 13 years old, we see this change occurring, roughly coincides with that period of time in which biologically human beings change from being sexually immature to sexually mature, okay, by going through adolescence, or more specifically puberty. So during that time, bodies produce more hormones, and both males and females, changing the appearance and shape of the body, making them ready to procreate sexually, as well as changing the bodies through secondary sex characteristics. So that is a biological change that human beings go through. Okay? And we often associate that with adolescence and assume then that this period of time, adolescence, is in some ways based on biological determinations. It is not. Okay? Sociologically, adolescence is what we call a social construct. In other words, we invented it. Okay? If you think about societies around the world, but more specifically societies that existed throughout history, in many societies, when you became sexually mature, in that society you were considered an adult. Okay? When we look at animals, we can clearly see that there's a period of time of sexual immaturity and then sexual maturity. And typically when you're talking about even domesticated animals like dogs and cats, we say, okay, they were not able to reproduce, then they were able to reproduce. Now they're adults. Again, not to draw too many parallels between animals and humans, but biologically, that is a pretty strict definition. And in a lot of cultures, as soon as a person was able to, was sexually mature and able to reproduce, they were considered an adult in that society. And even when we look at early America, we're not that far removed from that. 200 years ago, if a teenage boy or teenage girl, what we consider to be teenagers now, became sexually mature, they were usually at that point considered to be able to be married and go start their own families. Many cultures around the world, not only today but definitely historically, people were, sexually productive and were considered to be adults by that society. Okay? So where did this idea of adolescence come about? Well, clearly as society's gotten more and more and more complex, and we usually associate this really to a large degree with the Industrial Revolution, requires people to become more skilled, more education, more training. Okay? So we regard people in today's society at 12 or 13 years old to have absolutely no chance of succeeding on their own socially in society. So we basically take this idea that they're sexually mature but not socially mature, and we've stretched this period of time from about 13 to about 17 years old out and said, okay, and this is the root of a lot of conflict between children and parents. Think about the arguments you had with your parents, or if you're parents yourself, that argument you're having with your children. The children are screaming, I'm a grown-up, and the parents are saying, no, you're not. Okay? That is a social distinction. The children are quite right. They are sexually mature creatures and capable of reproducing, and adults are saying, you're not ready to join society fully, you're not ready to be out on your own. Think again about the threats your parents made. You wouldn't last 5 minutes out there, how would you get a job, how would you take care of yourself? And those are absolutely factual as well. So socially, we are not adults. Okay? And this period of adolescence in which society says we're going to acknowledge that you have some physical maturity, but you are not yet considered adults by society, is defined as adolescence. So what goes on during this period of time? We kind of not only slow the process down, but in a sense, societally, we've reacted to this invention of adolescence by giving teenagers or adolescents various tasks to accomplish. Sometimes we call them initiation rites. Okay, so here are some milestones we're going to put in there, and each time you accomplish one of them, you're a little closer to being called an adult. So we talk about the idea of just labeling them as teenagers, usually about 13, and some people say, well, weren't they teenagers when they were 11? Yes, but we actually say 13 is now when you're a teenager. What are some of the other milestones that people accomplish during this period of time? Usually getting a driver's permit at 14 or 15 years old and getting a license at 16 in Pennsylvania, is a way of, demonstrating this movement toward maturity. Many cultures have celebrations of movement toward adulthood. So in the Jewish faith, the bat or bar mitzvah is a movement toward adulthood. Again, religious communities talk about things like confirmations, or in the Catholic Church, getting your first communion and then being confirmed. Amish culture talks about the idea of a Rumspringa, where adolescents kind of exercise a bunch of freedom before they're required to make a commitment to the church. Latino or Hispanic communities, girls undergo or participate in quinceañera, so a celebration, so sweet 16 parties. These are all initiation rites which are meant to kind of quote unquote bring along adolescents toward this road to adulthood. At the very end of this, you generally see about 17 to about 18 years old. 18, we legally define you as an adult, so you are now allowed to do certain things that you weren't allowed to do the year before. In regard to education, we work toward graduation, and again, graduation becoming a big to-do. So you celebrate by dressing in academic regalia and having everybody, celebrate the fact that you've achieved this very important milestone of graduating high school. And then the celebrations that follow, typically in American society, prom. And prom, certainly, while there's other different types of initiation rites associated with education, like things like homecomings and all sorts of other things. Prom is generally considered to be different. And what do people do on prom? Act like adults. So you wear fancy grown-up attire, and you go to dinner, and you ride in a limousine, and you have this big party. So all these things are laid out there to kind of, again, temper this idea that we've invented adolescence as a way of kind of drawing childhood out longer, because modern industrial and now post-industrial society demands that people receive more education and training before they're ready. Toward that end, now we talk about this idea, and if adolescence is a product of the Industrial Revolution, transitional adulthood is definitely a product of the 20th century. Okay, you can clearly see here from the dates, we're talking from about 18 to about 29, and we call this period transitional adulthood, where once again it's kind of again this stretching out or lengthening of a period of preparation. For most people, especially in modern American society, we talk about what's, in fact, what are many of you doing right now? You are attending college, okay? So we recognize that in modern society it's become less and less and less desirable to just finish your education at the high school level, that you still need more training. But when we talk about this modern trend, even if I was teaching this class, let's say 50 years ago, 60 years ago, in the mid to late 20th century. Think about 1950s America. Even at 18, most people were considered adults. And if you talk to the average American family, you were 18, the message was, get out, you're on your own, go get married. Even if you attended college, you were pretty much largely considered to be kind of on your own. Or if you attended college, that was for another couple of years, and then the idea was, get out, buy a home, start a family, get a career, okay? That's become much less of a trend in our society. And again, sometimes I've brought this topic I've often had some reaction from students. Sometimes I actually had a student one time say, that's because kids today are lazy. Well, that's not sociology. That's not borne out. One student being lazy, or one person deciding they don't want to move out of their parents' house and start their lives, is clearly not sociology. Sociology is macro. We're looking at the trends in society, and when we look at the trends in society, we see this trend toward this period of transitional adulthood, where today's college students are much more likely to continue to live with their families, much more likely to continue periods of, again, this extended dependency, where there's kind of twofold goals to this. One is kind of an expectation of still trying to, quote unquote, find yourself or figure out what it is you want to do or accomplish with your life. There's much less pressure to get out and start families early, buy homes, to a certain degree even to buy cars, or quote unquote get yourself going out there. And there's much more of a gradual acceptance of responsibility even in the last couple of decades than we saw even in the middle of the 20th century. So we definitely see that as society once again continues to be more complex, we've taken this trend for increased dependency in childhood, the stretch out of dependency in adolescence. We've kind of now even extended that into this period of transitional adulthood. Then we approach what we sometimes kind of call the middle years, and it's actually pretty telling that in our modern definition, we're calling the middle years a period of time from 30 to 65. Okay? That represents a brand new trend since the Industrial Revolution in people's lifespans increasing. 100 years ago, the average lifespan was almost half that of what it is today. So in other words, we've almost doubled the human lifespan in about the past 100 years, and that's largely due to industrialization. We'll talk about that in a later module. But just the fact that we call the middle years up to 65, again, 100 to 150 years ago, people who were 65 were considered very, very elderly. Okay? And in our society, it's almost nothing for people to live up to and past the age of 65. And this long period of time from 30 to 65 is now considered the middle of people's lives. So what are some of the characteristics of this stage in the life course? Well, typically, even though we anticipate this and recognize this period of transitional adulthood, we usually, and again, if you think about modern society and its definitions and the way we interpret some of these symbols, usually by the time a person is 29 or 30 years old, the expectation is that they've, quote unquote, gotten their life together, that they have determined or established what they want to do, established a career, perhaps started a serious relationship that may lead to a permanent arrangement like marriage, that they've started a family, all those other kind of things. So middle years, we can kind of, one of the first characteristics we usually say that people's goals are either been established or well underway to being accomplished. However, as we just talked about in the last lecture, there's a frequent need for re-socialization. So as people change jobs, change careers, move and relocate due to economic circumstances or personal desires, there's a frequent need for re-socializing. Again, getting married or conversely getting divorced requires a lot of re-socialization. There's often, some of the characteristics of these middle years is often very conflicting pressures. Certainly when we talk about childhood, adolescence, and transitional adulthood, we're not saying that these people are exempt from pressures whatsoever, but it's usually pressure in for the more or less, at least in society's view, a pressure kind of forward to accomplish things, to again, to accomplish that level of education, training that'll get you ready for life. When we're in the middle years, we're generally talking about the concept of conflicting pressures. For most people, obviously the most important conflicting pressure exists between work and family. So if you've established a family, your family wants all your time and attention, and if you have a career, your career wants all your time and attention. So there's often this idea that people complaining of feeling torn between two very important goals. Also, for the first time, usually, again, it's not to say that other individuals might not have we talk about a typical life course. This is usually a time in life when people, for the first time, experience what we call being sandwiched between two generations. So all along, you've had the generation that preceded you, in front of you, your parents and the other people in society who are older than you. But for the first time, both as a generation and as individuals, people now, there's a generation that is coming after you. So whether or not you refer to this as the family that came before you is your family of origin, and the family that you created is your family of procreation, usually it's during this period of time that, again, the conflicting pressures of sometimes not only dealing with and now in some cases caring for the generation that came in front of you is also kind of balanced out by the need to take care of the generation that's coming up after you. So that idea of sandwiched. Then we get to, obviously, the final stage, which again has undergone a lot of change. 200 years ago, the idea of considering an entire group of people over 65 as being a life course would have been generally not regarded because there were just so few people in society. Clearly in society today we have millions of people who fall into this category of 65 and over. So we definitely know that industrialization has resulted in a prolonged life to the point now where people actually live well beyond 65 in a lot of cases. It's not unusual for people to live into their 70s, 80s, 90s, and even over 100 years old. Clearly, one of the things that marks this, again, continued resocialization process are things like deterioration of health. Clearly, despite the fact that we've increased human lifespans, we've not entirely solved all the problems of what happens to our bodies as they get older. So people in this age category are much more likely to experience, again, deteriorating health. And we've often talked sometimes about the idea of you prepared your entire life for introduction and participation in the workforce, and then there's generally an expectation, again, around the age of 65 for people to exit the workforce. But in modern society, another type of resocialization has occurred where you might retire but not completely exit the workforce. So whether or not elderly people completely retire and never work again, or transition into some other type of work situation, like working part-time or as a contractor, or, and we've sometimes seen this when we talk about conflict theory, jobs that were largely regarded as being jobs that were occupied by younger people, especially in their adolescence or traditional adulthood, are now being competed for by people who are retired. So a new phenomenon there, as well as the idea that one of the characteristics of these older years is this idea of the impending reality of the end of one's life. So we know that there's no course, no stage on this life course beyond the elder years, so the reality of death certainly becomes much more acute.